Greetings. Today I'm going to be talking with you about a new model for understanding seafood's health benefits. I'm Nick Ralston from Sage Green Energy and the University of North Dakota, and I've been working on this issue for about 20 years. There's further information available at my website at sagegreenenergy.com, and you can pose questions there, which I'm very willing to respond to anyone that corresponds. Today's discussion is about how healthy minds and bodies require good nutrition and how seafood is one of the best forms of nutrition that we have available. Studies are finding that eating ocean fish helps adults live longer, healthier, and happier lives. And we now know that mothers that eat more ocean fish during pregnancy have more intelligent children. And this is new information that has been well established now by numerous studies performed around the world. And we'll be discussing that. And I want you to listen carefully and share widely, because this information is important and it needs to be shared. Seafoods are rich in many essential nutrients, but too many people eat far too little seafood. And ocean fish are rich in protein, fats, important vitamins, essential trace minerals. So healthy nutrition has to begin before birth, continue throughout childhood, and should continue throughout our entire lives, because good nutrition contributes to longer, healthier, and happier lives. Ocean fish are probably the best source of selenium there is, because not only do they contain selenium, which is a very important trace element, but they also contain omega-3 fatty acids that are vital throughout the body, but especially in the brain. And selenium and omega-3 fatty acids work together. And that's the reason I'm mentioning them in this form, because if we don't get enough of the long chain fatty acids from our food, we can slowly make them, but it's difficult to make enough, especially since too many of us eat far too many of the omega-6 high fat types of foods that aren't healthy. The fats in fish are healthy. If a mother doesn't get enough of those long chain omega-3 fats in her diet, her body will have to steal them from her own brain, which is where those fats are most important. She'll steal from her own brain to make her child's brain. And similarly, if mothers don't have enough selenium in their diets, she'll rob her own tissues to make sure her child has enough selenium. Studies from around the world are showing that mothers that ate at least 2 ocean fish meals per week had children with far higher IQs than the children of mothers that did not eat ocean fish during pregnancy. Here's results from the ALSPOC study, one of the largest. The children in this study are now in their 20s, and this is one of the largest and best performed studies there's been. But the mothers that ate the lowest amounts of ocean fish, they had the lowest amounts of mercury. Here they are just partitioned by groups depending upon their mercury concentration. So group 0 to 1 had the lowest mercury. And you see that group did have a normal IQ. 100 is the established value for normal. But as they had higher mercury concentrations from eating more ocean fish, you can see the IQs jumped at each increment, until at the highest level of ocean fish consumption, they were getting about 7 to 8 IQ points better. Their children were doing much better. And it was the nutrients from the ocean fish that had this effect. Not only IQ, but also behavioral difficulties assessed at age 7. The children of mothers that had eaten the least amount of ocean fish had the most difficulties with their behaviors. Behavioral difficulties were far less as mothers' seafood consumption during pregnancy increased. So that's a very important issue. So a whole bunch of parameters were assessed. I don't have time to show them all, but scholastic performance, IQ, as I just showed, a whole host of neurofunctional and neurological assessments were performed, and all of them improved with increasing ocean fish consumption. And of course, this is not quite what we were led to expect, is it? And that's the importance of today's discussion, is we have to have a new understanding of things because the data is now in and we now know much more than we did back when those earlier advisories were generated. Ocean fish, like I said, they're very rich in the omega-3s that make up the brain and are also very important in controlling inflammation. And so the seafoods, because they're so rich in so many nutrients, including iron, iodine, and selenium, they're benefiting our health in so many ways, not just neurological development of children, but also heart health in adults, and also in prevention of some diseases, disorders that accumulate with age. So no nutrient works alone, and it's very important to understand that selenium and omega-3 fatty acids work together very, very tightly. The selenium-dependent enzymes prevent oxidative damage to the omega-3 fats, and those fats are very vulnerable, so they need to have selenium-dependent enzymes to prevent oxidative damage and reverse it if it does happen. So why are people still concerned about the mercury contents in the seafoods? Well, it's because we initially thought there were risks, and it was well-intentioned, but just poorly informed advisories that were promulgated early on when we didn't know very much. So Mercury, of course, was the god of thieves because he was associated with speed. Mercury is sometimes called quicksilver because it moves so quickly on the floor. Spilling this, by the way, is a very bad thing. Mercury is still incredibly toxic. It's the take-home message of today's talk is not that mercury is safe to be around. Quite the opposite. Mercury is hazardous. But anyhow, the mercury that spills, it can give off vapors, and mercury can cause significant harms, especially if you have a spill in an open room. But Mercury, the Roman god, the one famous for having the helmet with the wings and on his ankles, he was the god of thieves because thieves need to operate quickly. He was also the god of merchants. Notice the MERC, the same as the MERC of Mercury. Merchants wanted things to move quickly. And so Mercury was associated as being the god of merchants. But Mercury really is a thief because it can steal our health. But the question is, what is it stealing when it robs us of our health? Here's the alchemy depiction of mercury back in the earlier days of before chemistry had become a thing in the 1400s. 1500s, the alchemists created this symbol for Mercury. And these are supposed to depict the wings of Mercury's helmet. But to me, they look more like horns. And I kind of tend to think of Mercury as a little devil because it can cause so much harm. Now, the alchemists also were aware of sulfur because sulfur and mercury bind together very well. Sulfur's alchemy symbol was a triangle, a red triangle usually, depicting fire. And when the two are together, mercury and sulfur form a complex, actually a rock called cinnabar, which is deep red, very, very pretty as a pigment, but very hazardous if you have any in your food. The binding affinity between mercury and sulfur is 10 to the 39th. That's a 10 with 39 zeros behind it. So mercury and sulfur really bind together well. And mercury, we know that too much mercury can be harmful to children. That part we're not arguing at all. In fact, that's actually the major part of my studies. Minamata, Japan, where they had many, many tons of mercury dropped into a small bay, the fish had huge amounts of mercury. This was many, many tons of mercury being dumped into that small bay. The fish had terrible amounts of mercury. It was poisonous to adults that were eating the fish, let alone to the children that were exposed to mercury from their mothers eating those poisonously contaminated fish. So the severe harms were definitely proof. In fact, one of the earlier proofs that we had that fish could carry mercury and cause toxicity. Iraq, they were not eating ocean fish, they were actually eating seed wheat, which was pink, treated with mercury fungicide to prevent the mercury from, the mercury prevented the fungus from growing on the wheat. So that's a common treatment of seed wheat, but you're not supposed to eat the seed wheat. But the mothers that did, they experienced severe harm. And once again, adults were even poisoned by the amounts of mercury they were taking in, but children were especially vulnerable. In New Zealand and in the Faroe Islands, they studied the effects of seafood consumption, and there wasn't anywhere near the level of mercury that there were in Minamata and Iraq. So the harm was not as severe, but definitely there was still harm noted. However, the more recent studies have found that instead of harm, there are IQ benefits in the children. Just like I showed you from the Alsbach study in the United Kingdom, significant health benefits. The IQs of children rise, like I said, to 7 to 8 IQ points, in some cases almost 10. So in the United States, it was almost 10. And studies in Denmark and Spain have confirmed this. So what's the difference here? It's higher mercury is not causing harm, but these studies said, yes, it was. So you can understand why there had been concern and questions about this issue. So, but when the results of the biggest and best studies show that mothers need to eat more fish to improve their health and that of their children, you have to start assuming there's some differences between these groups and these groups. And that's the important point today. Selenium is the difference between those groups. Selenium, the name Selene is after the goddess of the moon. Selenium was discovered back in 1815. We recently had the 200th anniversary for it, and I was a keynote speaker at that event in Sweden. It was initially mistaken for tellurium, though, a related element, but tellurium means earth. So when they realized that they had a new element that wasn't tellurium, they named it after Selene, meaning moon. So selenium is the element that is required by those enzymes that prevent and reverse oxidative damage in the brain. Now, oxidative damage is relatively simple. If you've seen oxidative damage anytime you've cut an apple and noticed that it was nice and white when you first cut it, but as you let air get at the flesh of the apple, it rapidly turns brown. That's a nice visual depiction of oxidative damage, and you don't want that to happen to your brain. But your brain is having an awful lot of oxygen churn through it. 25% of every breath you take in, 25% of the oxygen from every breath goes to the brain. So the brain, being made of a very readily oxidizable material, those omega-3 fatty acids that I mentioned, they could very easily be damaged by the byproducts of that oxygen that's going through the brain. So we need selenium-dependent enzymes, which are the only ones that will protect the brain from these serious oxidative damage that would otherwise occur, and not only protect it, but reverse the oxidative damage when and if it does happen throughout the brain. So brain, heart, and many other tissues in the body simply cannot survive without selenium. And selenium is so important in the body that there's only one thing that can stop it from doing its job, and that one thing is mercury. Selenium was discovered long after the days of the alchemists, so it didn't have an alchemy symbol. So I created this one for it. And you notice I gave it a halo, and that's because selenium is always working in our favor. Too much selenium can be bad for you. I don't want to get that message mistaken. But the enzymes that prevent and reverse oxidative damage, they're protecting us. They're saving our lives. However, selenium shares a lot of chemical behaviors that are very similar to sulfur. And so, as you would expect, mercury and selenium bind just like mercury and sulfur did. But when mercury selenide forms, it's 1,000,000 times higher binding affinity. 10 to the 39th was the binding affinity between mercury and sulfur. For selenium, it's 10 to the 45th. 6 more zeros, 1,000,000 times higher binding affinity. So Mercury, I like to kind of jokingly report that Mercury likes to date a lot of sulfurs, but it intends to find and marry a selenium someday. These two are really soulmates. They've got so much higher affinity for each other. Now, Mercury can cross the placenta and enter the developing child's brain, and it's uniquely able to bind the selenium of those enzymes that are supposed to be protecting the brain of the baby. And it will inhibit those enzymes, keep them from performing their job, and the oxidative damage from all that oxygen that is churning through the brain will cause damage, and irreparable damage to the developing child's brain is going to be irreparable damage for life. So the important issue between what was happening in the studies where they were finding seafood causing harm versus those cases where we were seeing seafood was beneficial is how much selenium there was in relation to how much mercury. Across this axis, we're actually looking at how many atoms of mercury per atom of selenium. Mercury's in red, selenium's in blue. Pilot whale meat was 85% of the mercury that was consumed in the Faroe Islands, and in New Zealand, where they also saw subtle harm. There they were eating great white sharks, and that was actually slightly worse than a pilot whale, even more mercury relative to the selenium. So eating those types of seafoods, obviously that's going to be bad for you because you have a huge amount of mercury that's going to be binding a very small amount of selenium. The babies are going to be harmed by that, obviously. Mako sharks are similar. Swordfish, not quite so bad. Thresher sharks are actually not that bad at all. But all of the normal types of ocean fish that we typically think of when we're actually talking about seafood, salmon or tuna, have huge amounts of selenium relative to the mercury that they have. So these types of seafoods will not diminish your selenium status in your brain. They will improve it. And that's why we're seeing that mothers that are eating ocean fish during pregnancy, not eating whales or shark meat, but normal types of ocean fish, the children that they have are so much brighter. They have more omega-3 and more selenium. Their brains are just healthier. We created the health benefit value because it's so much easier to tell a mom if it's got a negative health benefit value. You can see some of these are very negative. If it's got a negative health benefit value, don't eat that during pregnancy. If it's got a positive health benefit value, all of these are positive. That's a seafood that will enhance your child's health and also, by the way, enhance the health of the mother. So eating seafoods with positive health benefit values actually diminish the risks from eating pilot whale or shark meat. In fact, the mothers in the Faroe Islands that were eating those pilot whale meat meals, if they had not also been eating ocean fish that were selenium rich, their babies' brains would have been severely harmed. In fact, looking at the umbilical cord bloods of the children in the Faroes, this is taken from the umbilical cord at birth, the amount of mercury, here's mercury across this axis and selenium across this line is the 1-to-1 axes. So if you're anywhere on this line, you've got exactly equal amounts of mercury and selenium. You can see that the umbilical cord mercuries of the children in the Faroes, those that were above this dotted line where the lowest observed adverse effects were, they were very close to this adverse effect of the 1-to-1 molar ratio. In fact, some of them were even below 1-to-1. They had more mercury than selenium in their blood. Whereas in the Hawaii Islands, where we just completed a study, the more ocean fish that moms consumed, the higher their selenium. You can see that the moms, the umbilical cord bloods in the Hawaiian moms are higher on average than any of these. And this line is showing the predicted ratio as they increase. They do not approach this line. They actually stay away from that line quite handily. And so that's how come we find that the more ocean fish mothers eat, the healthier their children. And that's exactly what we're seeing in all of these studies. So we created the health benefit value to reliably predict safety and benefits of seafood. So let's see if it works. In Minamata and Iraq, where there was severe harm seen, the selenium health benefit values were minus 5,000, minus 800, hugely negative, hugely horrible for any mother to eat. So obviously the health benefit value predicts correctly those foods should not be eaten. In the Faroes in New Zealand, the pilot whales the great white sharks in New Zealand had a minus 123 health benefit value. So that's very harmful. But fortunately, they were also eating regular types of ocean fish that had positive values. So they were mostly protected. Like I said, if it hadn't been for eating ocean fish with positive values, instead of subtle harms, we might have seen serious harms among these children. But we did see harm, and the health benefit value says, yes, we predict eating those fish is not going to be good for the child, and definitely we saw that there was harm. In all of these other studies, the health benefit values of the seafood consumed were all positive. That predicts a benefit, and so all did show benefits. So all of these studies, the selenium health benefit value reliably predicted the safety and benefits of the food consumed. It's the only reliably accurate index of seafood safety and benefits. So in summary, eating ocean fish enriches the selenium status of the mothers and their children and protects against mercury. And mothers that eat ocean fish improve the IQs of their children. And adults that eat ocean fish improve the health of their hearts, their immune systems, and increased selenium also appears to be associated with preventing certain degenerative disorders, disorders associated with aging. So warnings against eating ocean fish during pregnancy, those were based on well-intentioned but badly mistaken assumptions and misunderstandings from back before the time before we understood how mercury caused harm. Now that we understand how it causes harm, it's clear that eating ocean fish will protect against mercury toxicity, not contribute to causing it. Just don't eat whale meat and probably don't eat great white sharks, obviously. So since children lose nearly 8 IQ points when their mothers avoid eating ocean fish, women need to improve their seafood intakes during pregnancy. We don't want our children to be losing those IQ points. So mothers need to eat more ocean fish during pregnancy, not less. And I'm counting on each of you that's hearing this to get the word out about this, because the health of the coming generations is important to all of us, and we all want what's best for those kids and the mothers. All cultures around the world have this thing, they know seafood is brain food. And the more ocean fish that is eaten by the mom during pregnancy or by the child as they grow, the smarter those children are going to be. And that's what everyone wants. So this studies, the studies reported in this discussion were supported by US EPA and the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and was performed in collaboration with researchers from EPA and NOAA. So once again, see my website for additional information. And I'm intending to be available for questions live at this broadcast. So please get in contact with me that way too. So I hope to be talking with some of you shortly. And thank you. Muchas gracias.